There are some places that stay in your bones no matter how far you go. For me, that place was my ranch. 40 acres of red clay and green hills tucked just outside Creek, Texas. I used to say the air there smelled like freedom, a mix of pine, wild sage, and the sweet dust that hung in the air after a summer storm. My grandfather had built that ranch after returning from the Korean War, hammering every plank by hand, raising cattle to keep the family fed, and leaving behind more than land. He left a legacy. My father expanded it, planting trees along the southern fence line and digging the pond that shimmered like glass at dawn. By the time it came to me, it wasn't just a property. It was a promise I intended to keep. I had worked hard to preserve what they'd built. I restored the old barn, kept the cattle healthy, and turned the western pasture into a small training area for horses. On weekends, I'd invite the local kids to learn how to ride. It wasn't fancy, but it was honest work. And in a world where everyone wanted more, I was content with what I had. The HOA from the neighboring subdivision, however, never seemed to understand that. They had built their community right along my eastern border. Polished lawns, perfect sidewalks, and a set of rules for everything from mailbox height to grass color. They called themselves the Creekside Homeowners Association, and they were determined to beautify the area. At first, their letters were polite. Dear Mr. Miller, we'd like to invite your property into the Creekside Association. This would help maintain uniform standards in our growing community. I laughed when I read it. Uniform standards. My ranch was older than their entire development. I didn't need someone telling me what kind of fence paint to use. I tossed the letter in the burn barrel, but they kept coming, one every month, each a little less polite. Then came the visits. A few HOA board members, dressed like they were going to church, drove up one afternoon. The leader, a sharp-faced woman named Linda Garrison, stepped out with a clipboard. Mr. Miller, she said, her tone sweet but sharp underneath. We really think your property would benefit from our oversight. It would increase the neighborhood's value. I leaned against the porch rail and gave her a steady look. Ma'am, this land doesn't need oversight. My family's been here since before that neighborhood had a name. Her smile faltered. Well, I just hope you understand that Creekside is expanding. It might be best to get ahead of things. That was the first time I realized what they wanted. They weren't interested in inclusion. They wanted control. They wanted my land to fit their vision, their version of order, but I had no intention of giving them an inch. Over time, the visits stopped, and I figured they'd moved on to pestering someone else. I was wrong. They were just waiting for their chance. When my deployment orders came in, I knew I had to prepare the ranch carefully. I was heading overseas for 12 months, a long time to leave the place unattended. I met with my old friend, Carl, who'd worked for me part-time fixing fences and tending the horses. Carl, I told him, I'll be gone a while. Keep an eye on things. Feed the animals, check the wells, and make sure no one gets any funny ideas about the property. He nodded, shaking my hand firmly. Carl had lived in Creekside longer than I had, and he knew all about the HOA's antics. I also took legal steps. I renewed my property registration, paid off taxes in advance, and filed a caretaker agreement with the county just in case someone tried to claim abandonment. I made copies of everything and left one set with my attorney. When I finally left the ranch, I turned at the end of the dirt road and looked back. The sun was rising behind the barn, painting everything gold. I remember whispering to myself, I'll be back soon. Don't change too much while I'm gone. Deployment life had its rhythm, long days, short nights, and the constant hum of responsibility, even thousands of miles away. The ranch was never far from my mind. I'd think of it when I heard the wind over the desert sand, imagining it rustling through the oak trees back home. Sometimes, when mail came through, I'd get short notes from Carl. All's good. Horses fed. Grass dry this season. Simple, steady words that kept me grounded. But after a few months, the letters stopped. I figured he was busy. Maybe the weather had knocked out his phone line again. I didn't think much of it. Then one evening after a long patrol, I opened my inbox and saw an unexpected message. It was from an old friend, Ryan, who worked as a clerk in the county records office. The subject line read, Urgent, Creekside HOA claim on your property. My stomach dropped. The email said, Hey, I thought you should know the HOA filed ownership consolidation paperwork on your ranch. They've listed it under Creekside Development Expansion. Something's not right here. I reread it 3 times. It didn't make sense. I had all my legal documentation, everything paid and current. I tried calling Carl that night, but the call wouldn't go through. I sent messages, emails, nothing. Days passed before I finally reached the county database through a secure connection. When the map loaded, I stared in disbelief. The property marked Miller Ranch was gone. In its place was a new label, Maple Heights Estates, Phase 2. They'd done it. The HOA had taken my land, renamed it, and begun development, all while I was halfway across the world serving my country. I felt a wave of anger I hadn't known before. It wasn't just about losing the land, it was about the betrayal. The same people who flew their flags on Veterans Day had stolen from a soldier while he was deployed. I printed every document I could find, the false title transfers, the development permits, even the construction approvals. Each one bore the same signature, Linda Garrison, HOA President. For days, I barely slept. I contacted the US-based legal office, but they said it was a civil matter, something I'd have to handle when I returned. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play. There was no way the county could have approved that transfer legally. It had to involve forged papers, false claims, maybe even bribes. Every night after that, I'd walk outside and look at the stars. Somewhere under that same sky, my ranch was being torn apart. The barn, the pond, the fences, everything that had stood for 3 generations was probably being bulldozed to make room for asphalt driveways and artificial lawns. It burned inside me, but I made a silent promise. When I get back, I'll fix this, no matter what it takes. And in that moment, standing under foreign stars, I didn't know just how far that promise would go, or how many people would regret ever touching my land. 3 months after deployment, I'd fallen into the rhythm of Army life again. The endless drills, the dry heat, and the constant thrum of helicopters in the distance. Every day blurred into the next, a mix of duty, fatigue, and focus. But in the quiet moments, during guard shifts, or when the camp lights dimmed, my thoughts drifted back to the ranch. I pictured the old barn glowing under the sunrise, the windmill creaking softly, and the horses grazing near the pond. I could almost hear the crickets, smell the soil after rain. That image kept me steady, reminding me there was still peace somewhere in the world. Even if it was 1,000 miles away, mail was rare but sacred. Soldiers would trade meals just to hear their names during mail call. One evening, under the dim yellow lights of the mess tent, I heard mine, Sergeant Miller. The voice echoed through the chatter, and I looked up. The clerk handed me a small envelope covered in dust. I expected it to be from my caretaker Carl, maybe a quick update about the ranch, but when I saw the sender's name, Ryan Cook, County Office Creekside TX, my chest tightened. Ryan wasn't a man who sent letters for small talk. I opened it carefully. The first line made my stomach drop. You might want to check what's happening back in Creekside. The HOA filed ownership papers on your property. For a moment I thought it had to be a mistake. Maybe Ryan had mixed something up. I read the line again, slower this time. My property, ownership papers filed. The words didn't belong in the same sentence. My ranch was protected, fully registered, taxes prepaid, and legally documented. No one could touch it. I'd made sure of that before leaving. Still, something about Ryan's tone in that short note, blunt, almost nervous, told me this wasn't a misunderstanding. That night, I stayed awake long after the others had turned in. My cot creaked as I sat there staring at that one page under the flickering light of a small flashlight. The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. The HOA, those same busybodies from Creekside, had always wanted control of my ranch. They'd called it community integration, but I knew what it really was. Greed disguised as good intentions. The land my grandfather had fought to keep free from bureaucracy was worth millions now, especially since the area had developed. If they'd found a way to file papers on it, they weren't acting alone. Over the next few days, I couldn't focus. During briefings, my mind wandered. I imagined strangers walking across my fields, heavy machinery tearing down my barn, surveyors hammering stakes into the soil. It made my blood boil. When our unit got a short break, I rushed to the CUMS tent and used my officer access to reach the county's public records site. The connection was slow, and the sandstorm outside didn't help. But after several attempts, I finally pulled up the map of Creekside. My breath caught. Where my ranch once stood, 40 acres labeled Miller Agricultural Lot. Number pick. There was now a different name in bold. Maple Heights Estates, Phase 2. I stared at it for a long time. The map showed new boundaries, divided lots, and small gray rectangles where houses were being built. My ranch was gone, erased digitally as if it had never existed. I zoomed in further, and each lot showed a new owner name, all filed under one legal entity, Creekside Homeowners Association. At the bottom of the page, a digital signature stood out in sharp black letters, Linda Garrison, HOA President. It was no mistake. They had done it. I logged off and sat there in silence. I couldn't feel my hands. I thought about my grandfather's words when I was young. Son, land's not just something you own. It's something you guard. Because the moment you stop watching, someone will take it. I'd always thought he meant it metaphorically. Now I understood exactly what he meant. That night, I drafted an email to Ryan, asking for every document tied to the transfer. I told him to send copies to my military account and my attorney's office. I also tried to contact Carl, the caretaker. No response. I sent a message to the county office for confirmation, but the reply was vague. Ownership transfer completed per HOA Consolidation Clause 18B. That phrase meant nothing to me because there was no such clause in any property law I knew. Days turned into a week, and the more I learned, the worse it got. Ryan finally sent me scanned copies of the paperwork. The transfer document had a fake signature, my signature poorly imitated but enough to fool the untrained eye. The sale price listed was $0 under something called a community reclamation adjustment. My land was supposedly absorbed into the HOA due to non-occupancy. They claimed my property was abandoned. I clenched my fists so hard my knuckles turned white. I was serving overseas, wearing my country's uniform, and because I wasn't physically home to defend my land, they'd declared it abandoned. The arrogance of it was staggering. I didn't just feel anger, I felt betrayal. These were the same people who waved flags on Memorial Day and claimed to support the troops. Yet, they had stolen from one of them. That night I sat outside under a sky scattered with unfamiliar stars. I tried to calm the storm inside me. The desert wind was sharp and dry, carrying the faint smell of fuel and dust. Around me, other soldiers talked, laughed, wrote letters home. I stared at the ground and whispered, "You picked the wrong man to steal from." Over the next few weeks, I gathered everything I could. Ryan helped quietly, sending me building permits, development approvals, and emails between the HOA board and the county planning office. Each one was like a nail in their coffin. They hadn't just overstepped, they'd broken federal law. My ranch had been registered under an agricultural preservation zone linked to the Department of Defense's Rural Buffer Program. That meant any development on it without federal approval was illegal, but that was the thing they didn't know. They thought I was just another soldier with a patch of land they could claim and profit from while I was gone. As the evidence piled up, I started planning. I wasn't impulsive. I knew I had to move carefully, patiently. My deployment would end soon, and when it did, I would return home, not quietly, not politely, but with everything the law and my service could give me. I was done being the man who let things slide. Every night after that, I folded that letter from Ryan back into my journal. It was the reminder of what I was fighting for now, not just freedom overseas, but justice back home. I made a silent vow to my grandfather's memory, to my father's hands that had worked this land, and to the little boy I once was, running barefoot through those same fields. When I finally came home, I promised myself, Creekside would remember exactly who I was and what happens when you steal from a soldier. The day I landed back on American soil, I felt a knot in my chest that I couldn't quite name. Relief, anger, and a strange hollow ache, all mixed together. Deployment changes a man. You learn to live with noise, heat, and danger, but nothing prepares you for coming home to find your world stolen. I had spent the last few months collecting every scrap of evidence I could against the Creekside HOA. I had the fake signatures, the bogus permits, the fraudulent sale documents, all of it. The moment my boots hit the ground, I knew what I had to do. My first stop wasn't home. I drove straight from the airport to Fort Bragg to meet with someone who might actually understand the scale of what happened. His name was Colonel James Harlan, an old commander of mine who had moved into a logistics and property enforcement role at the Pentagon. He was a man who didn't waste words, but he respected loyalty and truth. When I walked into his office, he stood and shook my hand firmly. "Good to see you in one piece, Miller," he said. "Heard you've got yourself a mess back home." "That's one way to put it," I said, laying the folder of evidence on his desk. The HOA in my town sold my ranch while I was deployed, claimed it was abandoned property and split it into residential lots. They're building on it now. Harlan flipped through the papers, his brow furrowing deeper with each page. "This property, Creekside Ranch, right? You said your grandfather owned it." "Yes, sir. It's been in my family for 3 generations. He stopped and tapped a page with his pen. "You realize this land is listed in the Federal Rural Preservation Zone. That means any development requires clearance from the Department of Defense. It's part of the noise and security buffer for the nearby training base." I nodded. "Exactly. They never got that clearance. They forged my signature, faked sale papers, and filed through the county. I want it back. Sir, every inch." Harlan leaned back in his chair, thinking, "You might get more than that," he finally said. "If they built on protected land, they not only broke federal law but also nullified all private construction contracts tied to it. That's a serious violation and one the government takes personally." Within an hour, he had made a few calls, one of which went to the Army Corps of Engineers and another to the Department of Agriculture. By the next morning, the Federal Property Division had opened an official reclamation case. Harlan gave me a copy of the temporary injunction order, a document that froze all construction and transfers related to Creekside Ranch. The HOA had no idea what was coming. When I finally made the long drive back to Creekside, I didn't recognize it. My quiet ranch road was now paved, lined with shiny streetlights and signs that read Maple Heights Estates. There were new houses, some nearly finished, others still in frames. I slowed the truck and stared out the window. My barn was gone. The pond was filled in. The old oak tree by the fence, the one I used to climb as a kid, had been cut down. The sight hit me like a punch to the gut. I parked at the edge of what used to be my property and stepped out. The ground felt wrong beneath my boots, like it didn't belong to me anymore. A construction worker nearby waved me off. "Sorry, sir. This area is private now. You'll need to contact the HOA office if you've got questions." I gave a small, cold smile. "Oh, I've got questions," I said, "and I'll be talking to them real soon." The next morning, I showed up at the Creekside HOA headquarters, a glass-fronted office that used to be a grocery store. The receptionist barely looked up when I walked in. She asked, "Sergeant Michael Miller," I replied. "I'm here to see Linda Garrison." Her head jerked up at that. I could see the color drain from her face just a little. Within minutes, Linda herself appeared, her perfect hair and smug expression exactly as I remembered. But when she saw me standing there in uniform, her smile wavered. "Well, this is a surprise," she said tightly. "We didn't expect you back so soon." I held up a thick envelope and placed it on her desk. "That's a federal reclamation order," I said evenly. "Effective immediately. All development and occupancy on my property are suspended pending investigation. Any construction or sale is now a federal offense." She blinked, trying to recover her composure. "Mr. Miller, I think you're confused. The property was abandoned." "The HOA stop," I said, my voice steady but firm. "You forged my signature, Linda. You filed fake sale documents. You lied to the county. And you sold protected land. Do you know what that means?" Her face went pale. She tried to stammer something about community interest and public benefit, but I could see the panic flicker behind her eyes. She knew she was caught. 2 hours later, the first convoy rolled in military trucks, government vehicles, and local law enforcement. The residents of Maple Heights gathered in confusion, staring as uniformed officers posted bright orange notices on every property. Federal land. Reclamation in progress, trespassing prohibited. The HOA board members gathered near the entrance, demanding explanations, but no one listened to them. One of the federal inspectors approached me. "Sergeant Miller, we've confirmed it," he said. "The entire subdivision sits on federally restricted land. No legal construction permit was ever issued. The Army Corps will begin dismantling all unauthorized structures starting next week." I nodded, feeling a mix of satisfaction and sorrow. I hadn't wanted this, I'd only wanted my home back, but the HOA had turned it into a war. Later that evening, I stood by the remains of what used to be my barn. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the empty lots. The soldiers had set up perimeter markers, and the sound of diesel engines hummed in the background. For the first time in a long time, I felt something like peace. Linda and her board members were arrested 2 days later on charges of fraud, forgery, and illegal land transfer. The county launched a full investigation into how their paperwork had passed through unnoticed. As it turned out, they'd bribed a clerk in the records department, one who quickly turned on them once the feds got involved. Word spread through Creekside fast. Neighbors who'd once ignored my ranch now looked at me differently. Some thanked me for exposing the corruption. Others, who had already bought homes on the stolen land, were angry, but their anger wasn't my burden. When the federal agents finally packed up, I was left standing on that scarred piece of earth again. The land was damaged, yes, but it was still mine. I ran my hand through the dirt and whispered to myself, "Welcome home." That night, under the same stars I'd stared at overseas, I made another promise, not of revenge, but of restoration. I'd rebuild the ranch, just as my grandfather had after the war. And this time, no one, no greedy HOA or self-serving neighbor, would ever touch it again. It wasn't just about land anymore, it was about legacy. And I was ready to fight for it, the way a soldier fights for his flag. The morning the demolition crews arrived, the air over Creekside was strangely still. A thin fog hung low over the empty lots, and for the first time in years, my land was quiet again. No hammers, no saws, no shouting foremen, just silence. I stood at the edge of the property, boots planted in the same dirt my grandfather once plowed, and watched as the Army Corps of Engineers rolled in with their heavy trucks. Each vehicle bore the federal insignia, and behind them followed the county sheriff's cruisers, lights flashing softly in the mist. The subdivision the HOA had built, Maple Heights Estates, stood half-finished. Rows of expensive-looking houses with for sale signs still planted in front yards. It looked almost peaceful, but I knew that within hours, all of it would be gone. Linda Garrison and her board had tried one last desperate move the night before. Their lawyer had sent a cease and desist letter, claiming I was harassing the community and obstructing development. I didn't even bother to open it. The federal injunction order overrode every claim they could make. Still, I knew she'd show up, if only to save face. Sure enough, a white SUV pulled up just as the first wrecking crew positioned their machines. Out stepped Linda, her pristine suit clashing with the muddy ground, and 2 other board members trailing behind her. She marched toward me with her chin lifted high. "This is outrageous," she snapped. "You can't destroy people's homes. Families are moving in next week." I didn't raise my voice. "You destroyed my home first," I said. "You stole this land, forged documents, and sold what was never yours. The law's here to clean up your mess." Her lips trembled, and for a moment she looked less like the confident leader she pretended to be, and more like someone realizing her empire was crumbling. "You think this makes you a hero?" she said bitterly. "You're taking homes away from innocent buyers." I stepped closer. "No, you took their money knowing you didn't own this land. You lied to them, Linda. Those people deserve justice too." The sheriff, a tall man with a gray beard and a voice like gravel, walked up beside me. "Mrs. Garrison," he said calmly, holding a folder of warrants. "You and your board are under investigation for fraud, falsifying public records, and property theft. I'd advise you to step aside." Her face went pale. The board members beside her froze, one of them whispering something about calling their lawyer, but the sheriff wasn't waiting. Deputies moved in, reading them their rights as they were escorted to the waiting cruisers. The sight drew a small crowd from the nearby streets, residents of the Creekside neighborhood, curious and confused. Some whispered to each other, some filmed with their phones. I could hear bits of conversation drifting through the air. Is that the soldier? They said she stole his ranch. I heard the army took the whole place back. The engines roared to life as the bulldozers started their work. One by one, the illegally built homes came down. The sound was deafening, metal twisting, walls collapsing, dust clouds rising into the morning light. It should have felt satisfying, but it didn't. Watching those structures fall, I didn't see victory. I saw what greed had done to something pure. My land had been turned into concrete and greed, and now it had to be torn apart piece by piece to make things right again. A young couple stood nearby, holding each other as they watched what would have been their future home collapse into rubble. I walked over, still wearing my uniform, and introduced myself. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. "I know you didn't know. You were lied to." The man nodded, his eyes tight with anger. "We put everything into that down payment." She said the land was clear, said it used to be part of some old abandoned ranch. "It wasn't abandoned," I said softly. "It was stolen. I'll do what I can to help you get compensated. The state's fraud recovery fund will take care of that." He thanked me, and as they left, I turned back toward the land. Dust swirled through the air, the last of the false houses collapsing under the weight of justice. It wasn't pretty, but it was necessary. By noon, the Army engineers had cleared half the site. The county officials arrived next, setting up survey markers to restore the original property boundaries. When they reached the old center post, still buried under what used to be a foundation, one of the workers handed it to me. The wood was cracked and weathered, but I recognized it instantly. My grandfather had carved our family initials into it with a pocket knife when he first claimed the land. M. Miller's mark. I ran my thumb over those letters, feeling a lump rise in my throat. "This belongs to you, Sergeant," the engineer said. Double quotes, yeah. I murmured, holding the post like a relic. It always did. That night, I stayed after everyone left. The stars came out, brighter than I'd seen them in years. The noise of the day was gone, replaced by the sound of crickets and the faint hum of the windmill the HOA had left untouched. Probably because they didn't know what it was for. I sat on the back of my truck, staring at the open field where my barn used to stand. It was just dirt and weeds now, but somehow, it looked alive again. My attorney Rachel called as I sat there. "It's done," she said. "The county court signed the final ruling. Your ownership is fully restored. The HOA's assets are frozen, and their members are facing felony charges." I let out a long breath. Took long enough. She hesitated. "They're also offering a settlement. The government wants to know if you'll lease a small portion of your land for training overflow. They'll rebuild your barn as part of the deal." I smiled faintly. After everything, I think I can live with that. When I hung up, I closed my eyes and listened to the night. The rustling grass, the faint call of an owl. It felt like the land itself was breathing again. I thought of my grandfather, of his hands working the soil, and my father teaching me to respect it. I whispered, "It's ours again, old man." They tried, but they couldn't take it. In the following days, crews came to clean up the debris. The news caught wind of the story. Soldier returns from deployment to find HOA stole his ranch. Army reclaims property. Reporters showed up asking for interviews, but I turned most of them down. This wasn't about fame or headlines. It was about honor. The last thing to be cleared away was the fake sign that once read, "Welcome to Maple Heights Estates." I helped take it down myself. Underneath, half buried in the mud, I found the old wooden sign that had stood there for decades. Miller Ranch, 1953. I wiped the dirt from its surface and leaned it against my truck. That sign would hang again one day, right where it belonged. Justice had been served, not with revenge, but with truth. And as I looked out over the empty land, the rising sun washed everything in gold. I realized something. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of rebuilding, not just the ranch, but the legacy that had almost been lost. For the first time since I'd come home, I felt whole again. The land was free, the lies were buried, and the ranch my family's heart would live once more. Spring came early that year, as if the land itself was eager to start over. The first rains soaked the soil that had lain buried under concrete and steel for far too long. Wild grass pushed through the dirt like a promise, and the wind carried the scent of wet earth across the fields. I stood in the same spot where the last bulldozer had cleared the rubble months ago. The view was open and raw, but it felt alive. For the first time in years, I didn't see the ghosts of what had been stolen. I saw what could be rebuilt. Reconstruction wasn't easy. The government's offer to help restore the property came with paperwork thicker than a phone book, and half the contractors in town still hesitated to take my call, afraid of getting caught in legal leftovers from the HOA mess. But I didn't mind the struggle. I'd faced worse in deserts halfway around the world. Here at least, I was fighting for something that belonged to me. I started small, a fence first, not to keep people out, but to mark where home began again. My neighbors, the few who'd been against the HOA's greed from the start, came out to help. Old man Jackson brought his tractor, still sputtering from the 1970s, and the Morales family brought sandwiches and lemonade. We worked from sunrise till dusk, digging posts, setting rails, laughing about how long it had been since anyone had seen the land this open. When the last section of fence went up, Jackson patted me on the shoulder. "Your granddad would be proud, son," he said, his voice rough with age. "He always said this land had a way of taking care of good men." I smiled. "It's about time I take care of it again." The barn came next. The Army engineers kept their promise, sending a crew to rebuild it as part of the lease agreement. They worked efficiently, quietly, soldiers who didn't ask questions, just did their jobs. I helped whenever I could, nailing planks, painting the doors a deep red, just like my father had. Every stroke of the brush felt like erasing a scar from the past. Inside, I hung up the old wooden sign I'd found buried under the HOA's mess, Miller Ranch, ST 1953. I cleaned it carefully, polished the edges, and mounted it right above the barn entrance. The wood was cracked, the letters faded, but to me it was perfect. It wasn't just a name, it was a declaration. We're still here. News spread that the Miller Ranch was back in family hands. The local paper ran a story titled "Veteran Reclaims Stolen Ranch, Brings Land Back to Life." People I didn't even know sent letters, some offering help, others just sending thanks for standing up to corruption. I never thought of myself as a hero. Heroes don't bulldoze homes or sign legal papers. They just do what's right, even when it costs them everything. A few weeks later, I got a call from the couple who'd lost their home in the demolition, Eric and Lacey, the young pair I'd met on that foggy morning. They'd been reimbursed and had found a new home a few towns over, but they wanted to visit, just to see what the land looked like now. When they arrived, their little boy ran through the fields chasing grasshoppers while we stood near the new fence. "It's beautiful," Lacey said softly. "It's hard to believe this was ever a construction site." I nodded. "Land's like people. You can hurt it, bury it, try to claim it, but if it's got roots, it finds a way back." Eric smiled. "Do you ever think about opening it up again? Maybe a community farm or something?" I chuckled. "Funny you mention that. The county's been asking if I'd consider leasing a section for educational programs. Show kids how ranching works. Let them learn about soil, crops, and livestock. I think that's a good way to give back." That night, after they left, I walked the property again. The sun was sinking behind the hills, spilling gold light over the field. I could almost see my grandfather's silhouette out there, checking the fence line, just like he used to. My father's laughter echoed faintly in my mind, telling stories while we fed the horses. For years, those memories had felt like ghosts. Now, they felt alive again, part of the air, part of me. A few days later, I got an unexpected visitor. Sheriff Daniels drove up in his dusty cruiser, stepped out with a folder in his hand, and gave me a nod. "Thought you'd want to see this," he said, handing it over. Inside was a copy of the final judgment. The HOA was officially dissolved. Linda Garrison and her board had each been sentenced for fraud and conspiracy. The fines, the restitution, the community service, it was all there in black and white. "Justice served," he said simply. I read the paper slowly, then folded it up and handed it back. "I don't need it," I said. "Let it stay in your records. My justice is right here." I gestured to the open fields, the sound of birds, and the wind that moved through the grass like a whisper of peace. He smiled. "You're a better man than most. I'm just a man who got his land back." In the months that followed, life settled into a rhythm. The mornings started early, with the smell of coffee and the soft creak of the new barn door. I planted wildflowers along the fence, rebuilt the windmill's blades, and cleared out the small pond that had filled with weeds. By midsummer, frogs had returned, and ducks nested by the water. The land was healing, and so was I. Sometimes I'd get visitors, local kids, curious about the ranch that beat the HOA. I'd show them the fields, teach them how to mend a fence or spot animal tracks. Their laughter filled the air, and I realized something important. The land wasn't just mine. It was meant to be shared, respected, and protected. One evening, as the sky turned purple with dusk, I sat on the porch with a notebook. I started writing a letter, not to the government, not to the press, but to my grandfather. "You always said the land remembers who loves it. You were right. They tried to steal it, but they couldn't steal its soul. The soil still breathes your name, and every sunrise feels like a promise renewed. I didn't fight for revenge. I fought for remembrance, for what you built and what this ground still stands for. We're home again, and this time, no one's taking it away." When I finished, I folded the note and tucked it into a jar, buried it under the oak tree that had stood watch for generations. As I looked around, the rebuilt barn glowing under the evening light, the wind rustling through the fields, I realized the fight was truly over. Not with noise or victory speeches, but with quiet peace. The land was free. The lies were gone, and the Miller name had endured, not just in records or fences, but in the living earth itself. I leaned back against the porch rail, listening to the crickets sing. The stars shimmered overhead like distant campfires, the same ones my ancestors had seen long before me. I smiled, breathing in the scent of home, rich, honest, and eternal. After all the chaos, the courtroom battles, the tears, and the long nights, there was only one truth left. The land always remembers who it belongs to, and tonight, it remembered me. If you enjoyed this powerful story, don't forget to like, share, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe now to HOA Bright Reality for more shocking real-life inspired stories every week.